Don't deny the history of your homeland. Don't deny the history of your family. Don't deny your grandparents. Seek your roots. Look to history, and from there, build the future. And those who tell you that the national heroes are a thing of the past, or that it doesn't make sense, that now everything starts over again, laugh in their faces.
Among the long list of supreme pontiffs of the Catholic Church, there was one who, amid praise and criticism, left an indelible mark on the recent history of the Church of Christ. He was an Argentine, the first Jesuit to become Pope at the age of 76, named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. When he became the Vicar of Christ on earth on March 13, 2013, he took on a unique and special name in the history of the Church, Francis, in honor of St. Francis of Assisi. From then on, Bergoglio would serve as Pope amid profound changes, conflicts, and controversies, both inside and outside the Church. Controversies that are still ongoing today. His papacy, however, would not be only about praise and acclaim, but would also be filled with controversies and harsh condemnations. Join us to learn about the life of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches with the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments, which we always read, by clicking the bell to turn on notifications, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on December 17, 1936. His father, Mario Jose Bergoglio, was Italian, and his mother, Regina Maria Sibori, was Argentine of Italian descent. Jorge will be the eldest of the 5 children born to the Bergoglio-Sibori couple. The home in which this child was born had exceptional Catholic roots, which is why he was baptized on Christmas Day in 1936. From a young age, Bergoglio received a strong religious education, thanks to the influence of his grandmother Rosa and the nuns at the Institute, Our Lady of Mercy, where he learned to pray and received his first communion. On October 8, 1944, his home was always, in his own words, a center of affection and resilience, where despite economic difficulties, the family found joy and strength in prayer, unity, and also humor. However, despite the strong religious values in which he was raised, young Bergoglio did not yet feel a strong calling toward the priestly vocation. During his adolescence, Bergoglio studied at Technical School No. 12, specializing in chemical industries, and graduated as a chemical technician at the age of 16. In 1953, after which he worked briefly in a private laboratory in Buenos Aires, performing bromatological analyses to control the hygiene of food products. However, around this time, Bergoglio began to feel a slight interest in religious life. According to his testimony, on September 21st of that year, 1953, he felt the need to enter the San Jose de Flores parish to confess to a priest he didn't even know. During the confession, he says he experienced an intimate moment of special union with God, feeling that, quote, someone had been waiting for me for a long time, end quote, as he himself later declared. This event would have motivated him to delve deeper into the mysteries of faith, until, as he said, he finally entered the diocesan seminary of Villa Devoto in 1957. And the following year, specifically on March 11, 1958, he began his novitiate in the Society of Jesus, that is, the Jesuit order. This was not just any order, but one of the most influential and controversial of recent times. founded in 1540 by the former soldier and now religious figure Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuit order became a religious order at a time of deep crisis due to the Protestant Reformation. The Jesuits will be characterized by their vows of poverty, chastity, and special obedience to the Pope, in addition to strict rules of admission and internal military obedience, dedicating themselves to the mission of evangelizing, educating, defending the papacy, and promoting social justice throughout the world. In a short time, with the support of the European nobility, they gained significant ground both in Europe and in the rest of the world, with a special presence in educational institutions. Their intense activity as a religious order brought them numerous internal and external controversies. They ended up being expelled from different kingdoms, such as Portugal and France. And the order was eventually suppressed by the Church in 1773, only to be restored later in 1814. In the 20th century, after the Second Vatican Council, the Jesuits renewed their charism, with an emphasis on social justice and intercultural dialogue, standing out as an open and liberal order. This is the context in which Jorge Mario Bergoglio joined it in 1958 in Argentina. In his own words, the seminary was a time of spiritual and intellectual growth and commitment to religious life for Bergoglio. One aspect that will characterize Bergoglio in the public eye is his simple way of living his faith, showing special concern for the poor and vulnerable. But before we delve further into Bergoglio's formation, we must first pause to consider that spiritual and human body that is the Catholic Church, which is often little understood despite its omnipresence. From his preaching and resurrection in the lands of Judea, considered by the Catholic faith as the Son of God and the Messiah who came to redeem the world and save it from sin, Jesus of Nazareth is said to have proclaimed Simon, his disciple renamed Peter, as the rock upon which he would build his church. This would have made Peter the first pope and the highest authority, with a divine mandate to guide the people of God. Under the Catholic view, the process of consolidating the church as the communion of all believers in Christ was completed, guided and unified by the divine authority granted to Peter. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, his disciples received the commission from Jesus himself to spread the message of the Gospels and the commandments throughout the world, facing persecutions and sacrifices, but ultimately succeeding in spreading the faith. In its early centuries, among much of the Roman population and peripheral communities, in the 4th century, with the Edict of Milan by Emperor Constantine, Christianity became legal and later became the official religion of the Roman Empire. With Theodosius I, after the fragmentation of the Roman Empire, the Church would go on to consolidate itself as the central institution in Europe. During the later Middle Ages, it became the ruling institution of social life and also grew in power and influence. Although facing several setbacks because of this, such as schisms, divisions, and internal reforms, with the expansion of the Catholic religion to the Americas and other regions. After the 15th century, the Church became the most widespread religious institution around the world, but it started losing prominence. Later, with the arrival of modernity and the rise of rationalism and liberalism at the end of the 17th century, thus beginning a retreat into itself, which ends at the end of the 19th century with a renewed social and political role in the modern world. So, going back to Bergoglio, it is in this era and this context that he undergoes his formation as a seminarian. But let's look at another, more immediate phenomenon of great significance, in which our protagonist is involved, the era in which Bergoglio enters the seminary. Numerous changes take place within the Church, brought about by the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965. Originally convened by John XXIII, but completed by Paul VI, the Second Vatican Council was a kind of assembly in which all the bishops of the Church were called together to discuss important and controversial issues regarding the faith. And the Church itself, amid a historical transition, at a complex time of rapid change in the world, introduced several reforms amid widespread criticism, such as abandoning Latin and adopting vernacular languages for the liturgy, that is, the ordinary languages spoken in different countries. Likewise, the active participation of lay people in the liturgy and in the life of the Church, and the revision of various rites such as the sign of peace and the prayer of the faithful to give them a more communal and accessible meaning, as well as other reforms in different areas that deserve a separate video in that regard. After the Second Vatican Council, several alternative and more liberal schools of thought began to emerge around the world, proposing a different way of practicing the faith and a different way of living and interpreting it. An example of this was the so-called liberation theologies, which sought to harmonize Christian faith and Catholic practice with various tools from the human sciences and social sciences. In summary, these were turbulent years in the Catholic Church, which would go on to affect the lives of the youngest seminarians. Among them was Bergoglio. So returning to our protagonist, between 1958 and 1960, Bergoglio completed what is called the Juniorate, also known as the first years, at the seminary in Santiago de Chile, where he studied world history and church history, literature, Latin, and Greek in Chile. He would be influenced by Father Carlos Aldunate, who was one of the followers of the movement known as the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, a popular and controversial group from the post-conciliar period, that is, after the Second Vatican Council, which promoted prayer circles, healing sessions, and spiritual retreats as ways to get closer to God and the Catholic Church. These ideas and practices will take root quite well in Bergoglio's mind. So back in Argentina, in 1963, Bergoglio graduated with a degree in philosophy, and shortly after, while he was still in the seminary, between 1964 and 1967, he also worked as a literature and psychology teacher in several Jesuit schools in Santa Fe and Buenos Aires, standing out for his teaching talents and his humble manner with the students. Between 1967 and 1970, Bergoglio studied theology at the Colegio Universitario Máximo de San Jose in the town of San Miguel, also in Buenos Aires. He completed these studies here. Bergoglio is influenced by the already mentioned liberation theologies, which, although they originated in the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic world, gained significant prominence in Hispanic America. And finally, Bergoglio was ordained as a priest on December 13, 1969, just a few days before turning 33 years old. As a priest, Bergoglio began certain religious activities that would lay the foundation for his later rise in the church hierarchy. As a priest on July 31, 1973, Bergoglio was appointed provincial of the Jesuits of Argentina, that is, the superior of that congregation throughout Argentina. This already signaled his reputation within the congregation. As provincial, he faced numerous problems. Bergoglio worked extensively, for example, regarding the high level of participation that Argentine Jesuits had in Argentine politics, seeking to distance them from it. In fact, Bergoglio's motto during these years was to maintain the non-politicization of the Society of Jesus. However, his attempts soon proved largely futile. Bergoglio becomes both a witness and a participant in one of the most brutal episodes in the history of Argentina and Latin America, the so-called Argentine military dictatorship of 1976. After the death of General Juan Domingo Perón while in office on July 1, 1974, the presidency of the Argentine nation falls to his wife, Vice President Maria Estela Martínez de Perón, who was supposed to finish her husband's term until 1979. However, due to multiple reasons that deserve another video, numerous sectors of the military establishment would soon conspire to carry out a coup d'etat. The operation decides to put the commander-in-chief of the Argentine army, Jorge Rafael Videla, at the head of a new government. This coup was carried out on March 24, 1976. This established what has been called the National Reorganization Process, or the Civic Military Dictatorship, which would last until 1983. During this period, the military government, in order to combat what it labeled as subversive terrorism in Argentina and to normalize the nation's political situation, launched a harsh confrontation against movements it considered dangerous and subversive, such as left-wing factions within Peronism and communists in general throughout the country. However, one aspect that has been little discussed in these harsh confrontations and persecutions is the persecution experienced by the Catholic Church. Because they were fervent promoters of the aforementioned liberation theology, several Jesuit priests were associated with subversive movements, both with and without justification, which led them to also become victims of repression and persecution. In this context, Bergoglio, faced with this situation as the superior of the Jesuits, takes action and fights actively. First, to keep the congregation out of politics, and second, to help those who were already involved in it. Bergoglio even goes so far as to speak with Videla himself to discuss the case of several Jesuit priests who were disappeared by the police, such as Orlando Yorio and Francisco Hallex. Also, during his leadership of the Jesuits in Argentina, he organized and managed a clandestine network that helped those being persecuted, both priests and seminarians, as well as civilians, so they could escape to Brazil. However, shortly after this, in 1979, his leadership of the Jesuits in Argentina comes to an end. And the following year, in 1980, he is appointed as rector of the Colegio Universitario Máximo de San Jose, which will become one of his many places of study. As rector, he is known for his austerity, his closeness to the students, his emphasis on community pastoral life and spiritual reflection. At the same time, he combines this work with serving as parish priest at St. Joseph, the Patriarch Parish, in the humble San Miguel neighborhood. Here he stands out for his modest spiritual and social leadership, becoming a representative and spokesperson for many of the neighborhood's needs and those of its residents, the needs of the neighborhood and its inhabitants. After the end of the Argentine military dictatorship in 1983, Bergoglio will be one of the main people who will participate in the subsequent trials, especially in the so-called mega causa ESMA, a case that is open to prosecute the leaders and human rights violators of that military government. In fact, Bergoglio gives a 3-hour testimony that was recorded and made available to the public. By 1986, Bergoglio is removed from the Colegio Universitario Máximo de San Jose, and by 1990, he is transferred to the Jesuit residence in the city of Córdoba, in Argentina. His stay in this place was, in his own words, like a dark night, because he was removed from his educational duties, which allowed him to interact with young people in local communities, and instead, he was assigned to an administrative job, somewhat monotonous, in the Society of Jesus. However, little did he know that after this dark night, as he called it, numerous events in his life would lead Bergoglio to begin ascending the ranks of the Catholic Church toward a still uncertain future. Being closely acquainted with his profound religious spirit, his rapport with the faithful, and his various talents for spiritual and social leadership, the church authorities decide to appoint Bergoglio as auxiliary bishop of the archdiocese on June 27, 1992. As auxiliary bishop, Bergoglio is in charge of the parish activities and religious festivities in the Flores area, which was the same area where he was born and where he grew up. In 1993, he is appointed Vicar General of the Archdiocese, which allows him to have a broader role in the administration and pastoral work of that archdiocese. Just as during his 24 years of religious life, Bishop Bergoglio stands out for his humility, simplicity, and closeness to the people. He took public transportation, refused to use the telephone, and it was common to see him on the street. He spoke with the faithful and frequently met with young people. He was also a fan of the San Lorenzo soccer team and enjoyed opera and tango. After the death of the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Antonio Quaracino, Bergoglio was the church's preferred choice to fill that position, and so he was consecrated Archbishop of Buenos Aires on February 28, 1998. Shortly afterward, specifically, on February 21, 2001, then Pope John Paul II made Francis a cardinal of the Catholic Church. And from his new position, Bergoglio holds several posts in various important bodies of the Church, such as the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, the Congregation for the Clergy, the Pontifical Council for the Family, the Congregation for Divine Worship, and the Discipline of the Sacraments. With the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, where he was becoming increasingly prominent, a sign of the great prominence that Cardinal Bergoglio had already gained. It was in April 2005 when Pope John Paul II died and the conclave began. That same year, Bergoglio was, along with Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, one of the favorites and most talked about among the members of the College of Cardinals. However, who was chosen? The one elected was Cardinal Ratzinger, who took the name Benedict XVI, beginning his pontificate on April 19, 2005. By then, as we have seen, Bergoglio already had a very good reputation both inside and outside the church. So between November 2005 and November 2011, Bergoglio was the president of the Argentine Episcopal Conference, the body that brings together all the bishops and archbishops of that country. During these years, Bergoglio advocated for the beatification of 3 priests and 2 seminarians who were killed during the so-called San Patricio massacre at the beginning of the Argentine military dictatorship in 1976. Also during these years, Bergoglio had political clashes, first with President Nestor Kirchner and later with his wife Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, as well as with several non-governmental organizations over issues such as his opposition to the legalization of abortion and to so-called same-sex marriage, issues that Bergoglio, as a follower of church doctrine, upheld. However, despite this, Bergoglio maintains a position in which the church, instead of withdrawing and completely rejecting them, should rather seek to approach these groups, both feminists and those who supported other types of social reforms, to seek a kind of peaceful understanding and, under the guidelines of Catholic teaching, to reach a better agreement with them. This position brings him both applause and criticism. As Archbishop and Cardinal, Bergoglio also advocates for strengthening the foundations of the Church, that is, the small parishes and communities which he encouraged to be defenders of the poorest and most dispossessed, earning him the nickname at that time of the Bishop of the Poor. This nickname was reinforced by his continued austere and humble lifestyle. He did not live in the Archbishop's palace, but rather in an apartment. He refused to use a limousine and cooked his own food. By December 2011, upon turning 75 years old, he submitted his resignation from the archbishopric, as required by canon law. In fact, by this time, he was already expecting to retire soon and move to a home for elderly and sick priests, where he already had a room. However, Bergoglio was not yet 80 years old, and he was still a cardinal. These were the requirements for being elected pope. On February 28, 2013, in a surprising move for the world, Pope Benedict XVI resigned from his position as head of the Catholic Church. An event like this hadn't happened in 600 years. Questions and speculations quickly arose from those who believed there were forces shaking the Church from within. But these mysteries and speculations will be left for another video. When the conclave opened in 2013, after the resignation of Benedict XVI, Bergoglio was not initially one of the most popular candidates in the world, as were the Italian Angelo Scola or the Canadian Marc Ouellet. However, in the midst of that mystery that fills the Sistine Chapel during Sede Vacante, the period when the Church is without a pope, on March 13, 2013 at 7:05 in the evening in Rome, white smoke rises from the chapel's chimney. It was the sign that the new pope had already been chosen. The uncertainty of the moment ends when Cardinal Jean-Louis Tauran announces with great joy, as the prayer in Latin says, that the new pope had been elected and that it was the Argentine Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who now took the name Francis in honor of the humility and dedication to poverty of St. Francis of Assisi. Just then, Bergoglio, now Francis, steps out onto the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square. The cheers from the crowd and the Catholic world become incessant. To meet the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church, who was also the first Latin American Pope and the first Jesuit Pope in history. This is how Francis began his pontificate, one that for many would be fruitful in various aspects, and for others would not be free from controversies and debates. On March 14, 2013, the day after being elected Pope, Francis celebrated his first Mass as Supreme Pontiff in the same Sistine Chapel where the conclave had taken place. And the next day, March 15, he gathered all the cardinals to thank them for their support in the recent conclave. And he mentions the legacy of his predecessor, Benedict XVI, about whom he says, open quote, "A great gratitude and affection for my predecessor who revitalized the Church with his faith, his knowledge, and his humility." End quote. At the beginning of his pontificate and throughout it, many people, both inside and outside the Church, believed that Pope Francis was going to be a sort of liberal progressive who would come to change the Church's historic positions on controversial topics such as abortion, euthanasia, people with same-sex attraction, so-called global warming, capitalism, and many other issues that had been in vogue in recent years in the 21st century. However, the reality was somewhat different. Beyond Pope Francis's open approach and style, which concerns the fundamental aspects of the Church, Pope Francis maintained the same positions that the Church had held throughout its entire existence. According to scholars and parishioners, in all the complexity of his mission as Vicar of Christ and Shepherd of God's people, Francis will have a pontificate that, although different in various aspects and styles, will always remain attached to sacred tradition, the magisterium, and the work of his predecessors. And rather than endorsing all the slogans and trends of the contemporary world, he maintains the vision and spiritual role of the Church over its faithful. In his first year of pontificate, Francis is already beginning to stand out in a unique way on various issues. For example, in May 2013, he became the Pope who canonized the most saints during his papacy, when he canonized 815 people in a single day, Antonio Primaldo and the 812 martyrs of Otranto, which was an Italian town that in the 15th century had resisted the siege of the Muslims, who had killed all the inhabitants of that town. He also canonized the Colombian nun Laura Montoya and the Mexican nun Maria Lupita Zavala. Likewise, Francis deepens the Vatican's relations with the project called Inclusive Capitalism, an initiative by major financial and banking magnates worldwide to promote various social and economic agendas. This initiative has been heavily criticized by various sectors, but it arrived at the Vatican in 2012, and with Francis, they established various working agreements with the high Catholic clergy. He also begins an extensive round of talks with presidents and leaders of various nations around the world. Between May and July, he receives figures such as the President of Lebanon, Michel Sleiman, with whom he agrees to provide greater humanitarian aid to refugees both Christian and non-Christian, from the Syrian civil war. He also receives the Colombian president, Juan Manuel Santos, whom he asks to ensure that the so-called peace agreement in Colombia is decisive and definitively resolves the armed conflict in Colombia. In turn, he meets with German Chancellor Merkel and, among other things, emphasizes an aspect that is often ignored in world politics, such as the silent persecution of Christians, which the Church was subjected to in Europe itself and other parts of the world. He also receives the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and they spoke for 20 minutes about the country's political situation after the death of President Hugo Chavez. Francis reiterates to Maduro the request of the bishops of Venezuela and Cardinal Jorge Urosa to stop the repression against the political opposition. On the other hand, Francis also promotes the so-called inter-religious dialogue, receiving the Patriarch of Alexandria, Teodoro II, and Archbishop Justin Welby, who was the leader of the Anglican Church, to discuss topics such as ecumenism and the revaluation of Christ's teachings in the modern world. On July 5th, he publishes his first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, where he presents faith as a luminous gift that guides the consciences of the faithful and allows them to distinguish between good and evil. At that time, the Pope also leads World Youth Day, held in Brazil. There, the Pope takes the opportunity to visit poor favelas, rehabilitation hospitals, and neighborhoods cleared of drug trafficking. That's why Time magazine puts his photo on the cover that year with the title The People's Pope. In August 2013, Francis issues a document called Motu Proprio, aimed at preventing and combating money laundering, the financing of terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, in light of the brutal scenes witnessed in the wars in Syria and Gaza. During this time, the Pope will make some remarks about the existence of, quote, a gay lobby within the College of Cardinals. That is, a group of cardinals who use sexual blackmail as a means to obtain favors, and that promoted doctrines foreign to the tradition of the Church. 2014 will also be a year of extensive travel and calls for peace. On March 27, Francis meets with the American President Barack Obama for the so-called resumption of commercial relations with the island of Cuba. And he also makes, although unsuccessfully, several attempts to bring together the leaders of Israel and Palestine to establish a dialogue between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. On April 27, on the other hand, the canonization of the former Pope John XXIII and John Paul II is celebrated in St. Peter's Square, an event that is received with joy in the Catholic world. However, the Pope's activity not only covers parts of the Western Hemisphere, but he also carries out extensive work in the Eastern Hemisphere, especially in South Korea, where he is on a visit from August 13 to 18. And he makes several references to the division of the peninsula due to the war and the role that the Church had played in those societies. Thus, Pope Francis begins the new year, 2015, with the creation of 20 new cardinals, an official trip to Sri Lanka and the Philippines, and the proclamation of an extraordinary Jubilee year, 2015-2016, during which the Church undertakes a profound pilgrimage, days of prayer, and strengthening of faith worldwide. The Jubilee of that year was called the Jubilee of Mercy, emphasizing the charity that should fill the hearts of the faithful in the face of those displaced by armed conflicts and natural disasters. This Jubilee will be remembered as one of the largest and most fruitful the Church has seen, since Francis led a great number of pastoral visits to prisoners, visits to the sick, and especially to migrants and refugees. In May, Francis published his second encyclical called Laudato Si', in which, within the framework of global action for the planet, Pope Francis considers the earth as our common home given by God, which we must care for and preserve in its entirety. Also in September 2015, Francis visits the United States again and also Cuba, where he meets with Fidel Castro as well. and with Barack Obama to encourage negotiations between both countries for the resumption of diplomatic relations and other alliances, emphasizing in his statements the so-called humanitarian situation, not only of the migrants, but also of a large part of the Cuban people. In turn, in November, he travels to the African nations of Kenya, Central African Republic, and Uganda, where he makes several observations about the economic exploitation of third world countries and about the persecution that even today the modest Catholic communities throughout Africa still suffer. By 2019, however, Francisco was at the center of some of his most memorable controversies that year. An Italian court sentences the priest Mauro in Insoli to prison, finding him fully guilty of having sexually abused several children. Before becoming pope, Francis had defended the accused, and as pope, he would have reversed Benedict XV's decision to remove Insoli, the accused, from the church. In later statements, Francis would say that he mishandled the Insoli case, and he would state, quote, "I didn't understand these things well, and I chose the more lenient of the two sentences. But after 2 years, the priest relapsed. I learned from this." End quote. However, the same kind of mishandling would happen again with some bishops in Chile and in the United States in later years. Also around this time, the Pope would be harshly criticized by those who believe that the papacy should serve as a political voice in the world regarding the situation of the governments of Venezuela and Nicaragua. In these situations, the Pope always called for peace and sincere dialogue. Also around this time, the Pope will show a certain aversion to the candidacy of the Republican candidate in the United States, Donald Trump, making critical comments regarding the persistent statements of the presidential candidate about building a wall along the border between the United States and Mexico. The Pope will say, and I quote, that a person who only thinks about building walls of any kind and not about building bridges is not a Christian. End quote, to which Trump responds shortly after by saying, and I quote, "It was disgraceful for a religious leader to question a person's faith." End quote. And this will be the beginning of what, once officially in office starting in 2017, will be the cordial but tense relations that Donald Trump will have with Pope Francis. However, the controversies are not only directed outside the church, but also within its own ranks. In that same year, 2016, Francis publishes the letter Amoris Laetitia, where he makes some exhortations about the access of divorced people to the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist. Because of the content of this letter at the time, 4 cardinals, led by the American Raymond Burke, sent the Pope a series of questions about this issue, which Francis never answered. Returning to his pontificate, Francis begins the year 2018 with a series of notable actions. In January 2018, nearly 5 years into his pontificate, he makes his official visit to Chile. There he will meet with President Michelle Bachelet and hold a mass attended by 400,000 people in O'Higgins Park in Santiago, Chile. And he strongly criticizes the recent cases of abuse by priests in Chile itself. However, a widely remembered moment from his visit to that country is when he visits the San Joaquin Women's Penitentiary Center, where he meets with the incarcerated women and their children, bringing them a message of Christian love and reconciliation. But beyond this, 2018 will not be a year of major trips, although it will still be a year of significant ecclesiastical activity. In June, Francis creates 14 new cardinals and approves the canonization of Pope Paul VI. He also causes some commotion again by deciding to remove the Archbishop of Washington, Theodore McCarrick, for engaging in inappropriate sexual conduct. The year 2019, in contrast, will indeed be a year of intense activity for the Supreme Pontiff. In January, between the 23rd and the 27th of that month, he visits Panama for the World Youth Day of that year, having an important interaction with the young people gathered at that event. It is worth noting that Pope Francis, despite the controversies against him, had begun to gain more popularity and to be better regarded among young people and children. This is due to factors such as his ease with language, his calm and gentle demeanor, and his simple and humble behavior during meetings and audiences, where young people ask the pontiff no less interesting questions. In this way, Pope Francis will also be called the Pope of Young People. Then from February 3rd to 5th of that month, he made a historic visit to the United Arab Emirates. It was the first time a pope had traveled to that historically Muslim country, and there he was received enthusiastically by the people celebrating a mass in Abu Dhabi, attended by more than 100,000 people. Between March and November, Francis visits these places. Morocco, where he celebrates a mass for the country's Catholics in the presence of the Muslim King Mohammed IV. In Bulgaria and North Macedonia, becoming the first pontiff to visit that nation. In Romania, he once again calls for ecumenism and spiritual unity between Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Mozambique, Madagascar, and Mauritius, also as part of a new African tour. And to close that year of travels, Francis visits Thailand and Japan. In Thailand, he meets with several Buddhist leaders, where, although he does not go so far as to state, as has been mistakenly reported in the media, that all religions lead to God, he does insist. He insists that other religions, like Buddhism, given that they bring together large numbers of souls, must advocate for salvation, for peace, and for reconciliation among peoples. In Japan, he visits the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which at the time they were destroyed, were the cities with the highest density of Catholics in all of Japan. By the year 2020, the 7th year of his pontificate, the activities of the church and the world would be affected by the global quarantine imposed by governments on the grounds of protecting global public health. These were times of great chaos and anxiety worldwide, with a lot of panic and psychological uncertainty. Even without church services, he keeps in touch with the parishioners through various alternative channels. He ends up adapting the liturgy and much of his behavior to the guidelines of the moment, generating changes that are still felt today in the church all around the world. In this context of great panic and collective fear on a global level, on March 27, 2020, another of the most remarkable moments of his pontificate takes place. When Francis appears alone in the middle of a rainy afternoon in a completely empty St. Peter's Square, and he officiates a mass where he meditates on the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus goes through a storm with his disciples, drawing an analogy with the storm the world was going through. And finally, extraordinarily, he gives the historic Urbi et Orbi blessing to the people of Rome and to the whole world. In October of that year, he also publishes the controversial encyclical Fratelli Tutti, in which he calls for fraternity and social friendship as fundamental paths to building a more just, peaceful, and inclusive world. And in November, he creates 13 new cardinals. With the gradual lifting of restrictions, Pope Francis resumes his duties as leader of the Church and head of state. In March 2021, he travels to Iraq, becoming the first pontiff in history to visit that nation, a country whose Christian population had been worryingly reduced over the years and throughout the war. Later, Francis would say that during that trip, he was the victim of 2 assassination attempts by radical Muslims. In September, he visits Hungary and Slovakia, and in October, he receives the President of the United States, Joe Biden, in Vatican City, in a meeting that lasts 45 minutes. In November, he inaugurates the World Day of the Poor, which becomes an ordinary Sunday in the ecclesiastical calendar dedicated to sharing with the poor and homeless from all over the world. Francis spends that day with 500 poor people in Assisi, Italy, with whom he eats and shares. By the year 2022, As the world resumed its normal activities, Francis was already approaching 86 years old and was 9 years into his papacy. Around this time, the Pope's health also began to decline, forcing him to use a cane until he eventually needed to move around in a wheelchair. In January 2022, he dedicated the first Mass of the year to raise his voice, as he had done before, against violence against women, exclaiming, open quote, "To hurt a woman is to insult God," close quote. In February, war broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and in response to this, Francis took steps to mediate the conflict. And he urges those countries to have the courage to raise the white flag and open themselves to negotiation, a request that Ukraine rejects. In June 2022, he promulgated a new apostolic constitution, responsible for regulating the internal aspects of the clergy, called Predicate Evangelium. This deeply reforms the Roman Curia. In addition, it formally integrates the Commission for the Protection of Minors, reorganizes and simplifies structures for greater efficiency, and it strengthens the autonomy of the local churches, guiding all Vatican administration toward a more dynamic, collaborative, and people-centered evangelizing mission, closer to the people of God. At the end of that year, 2022, he received the news of the death of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who passed away on December 31, 2022, and whose burial took place on Thursday, January 5, 2023. Francis, despite his advanced age, never gives up on his mission as the Supreme Pontiff of the Church, carrying out various activities of this kind in the months to come, which will also be his last months on earth. By February 2023, Francis travels to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in South Sudan to visit communities with the purpose of promoting peace in these two countries, which have long been bloodied by civil wars. On March 29, his health deteriorates again when he has to be hospitalized due to a respiratory infection, which causes his presence during Holy Week that year to be reduced. He is discharged on April 1. In August, Francis presides over World Youth Day, held in Lisbon, Portugal. Between August 2 and 6, Francis once again shows his closeness to the young people, who number more than 1.5 million, 1,500,000 attendees in what has been considered one of the most important gatherings in the history of the Church and of this event. In September, the Pope becomes the first pontiff to visit Mongolia, where he prays and meets with the small Mongolian Catholic community of about 1,500 faithful, to whom he gives some religious images as gifts. In November, politics once again comes knocking at his door when the newly elected president of Argentina, Javier Milei, who in previous years had even said that Francis was the evil one on earth. He calls him on the phone to ask for his blessing, to which the Pope agrees and sends a blessed rosary. In December of 2023, the Pope was at the center of one of his latest controversies, with the text called Fiducia Supplicans, a document published on the 18th of that month. The document authorizes blessings for people in same-sex couples and for couples in irregular situations, although without equating them to marriage, which the Pope still strongly opposes. The reaction was immediate, and the media, as well as many parishioners, believed that the Pope was blessing homosexual unions. However, the Pope himself came out to clarify that the blessing was for the people, not for the union itself, reaffirming the Church's position regarding what marriage is. By 2024, during that year, Pope Francis was involved in a series of events and gestures. He begins the year by celebrating the Solemnity of St. Mary, Mother of God, and the World Day of Peace, where he delivers his annual message about peace. And in January, he also dedicates a general audience to the topic of sex, describing sexual pleasure as a gift from God and harshly criticizing pornography. In February, he orders an investigation into Cardinal Gerald Cyprien Lacroix for accusations of sexual abuse and canonizes Maria Antonia de Paz y Figueroa, the first Argentine saint. That same month, he meets with the Argentine President Javier Milei at the Vatican in a gesture of rapprochement after previous public tensions between the two leaders. In April, he resumes the title of Patriarch of the West as a gesture toward the Orthodox Church and makes a historic visit to Venice. He participates in the Art Biennale and visits the Giudecca Women's Prison, becoming the first pope to attend the Biennale. In May, he publishes the bull Espes Non Confundit to proclaim the ordinary jubilee of the year 2025. At the end of that month, a controversy breaks out over an alleged homophobic remark by the Pope, in which he reportedly complained about the high number of homosexual seminarians in the Church's seminaries, a remark for which he ends up publicly apologizing shortly afterward. As a result of this, in June, he calls for caution regarding the admission of people with same-sex attraction into seminaries, and he warns about the danger of so-called progressive and anti-Christian ideologies that could be present within the Church. Additionally, he participates for the first time in the G7 summit, where he talks about topics such as artificial intelligence and meets with world leaders. Meanwhile, a few days later, he praises the value of humor and laughter during an audience with comedians and actors held at the Vatican. The following months are going to be quite hectic. In July of that year, 2024, he removes the Italian Archbishop Carlos Maria Vigano for the crime of schism, that is, for forming a current of thought contrary to the teachings of the Church. On the 13th, he issues a statement expressing his concern and solidarity after the attempted assassination of former President and candidate Donald Trump, considering that event as a wound to democracy. In August of 2024, he issues some statements about the events in Venezuela following the elections of July 28th, aligning the Holy See with the call of the Venezuelan Episcopal Conference to verify the transparency of the electoral process. He also officially dissolves the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, a Catholic group from Peru accused of multiple abuses and controversies. In September, he begins what was the longest trip of his entire pontificate, traveling through countries in Southeast Asia and Oceania, which included Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, East Timor, and Singapore. The 11-day trip, covering 32,000 kilometers and 44 hours of flight, would include more than 33 meetings and 16 official speeches. During that trip, the Pope reminded the people of those countries and the small Catholic communities that the arms of the Church, even if they seem distant, were always open to them. From October to December 2024, some events will also occur, such as the escalation of conflicts in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. Then, with Israel's incursion into Lebanon, a situation in which the Pope denounces the excesses of the State of Israel and calls for the protection of Christian and Catholic communities, both in Israel and in Palestine. As a media phenomenon, especially in the Internet era, Pope Francis had no equal in the world. However, little did the Pope, the Church, and the whole world know that these would be the last months of Pope Francis. Despite the fatigue and exhaustion from health problems, Francis continues to make history. In January 2025, he names the year of the Jubilee of Hope and appoints the first woman in charge of a dicastery of the Church, the nun Simona Brambilla, who will head the dicastery for consecrated life and societies of apostolic life. In his first messages of the year, the Pope calls for a firm respect for humanitarian law in conflicts, asking the faithful not to forget that war is always a defeat. He also sends a strong message to child abusers in his first catechesis of the year, denouncing on Wednesday what he called the plague of child labor and other abuses suffered by children. And he said that anyone who harms or exploits a child will have to answer to God. In one of his latest actions, the Pope announces the upcoming canonization of the first Venezuelan saints, Dr. Jose Gregorio Hernandez and Mother Carmen Rendiles. On February 14, the Pope is admitted to the Agostino Gemelli Hospital in Rome, presenting with a respiratory infection and fever. His hospitalization reveals several critical moments regarding the pontiff's health, lasting until March 23, when he is discharged to continue his recovery at the Santa Marta residence. Despite needing rest, by April 13, he participates in the Palm Sunday Mass, which marks the beginning of Holy Week that year. Despite his delicate health condition, the Pope fulfills his duties as Supreme Pontiff even during the days of Holy Week in 2025. And just one day after Easter Sunday, as if he had fulfilled his final duties, Pope Francis passes away on April 21 at the Santa Marta residence in Vatican City. The death of the pontiff makes headlines around the world, plunging the faithful leaders and politicians of all stripes, and even people outside Christianity, into mourning. His work may not be as theological, doctrinal, or magisterial as that of some of his predecessors, but it would certainly have an important personal and communicative character. He revived the debate, whether with supporters or critics, on vital issues such as the Church's outreach and evangelization, on the meaning and role of the Catholic Creed, and on numerous social issues that are of vital concern to a large part of the population. His papacy, given the extraordinary times in which he lived, was one of the most outstanding among the recent successors of St. Peter. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and want to remind you that your support really helps us. By interacting with the channel, leaving your comments, liking the videos, sharing the material on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else, and by clicking the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new content. So thank you all once again, and may God bless you.